please do use the chat to sign in so that what I do is, in case you're wondering, I have a separate spreadsheet that I use as a kind of roll sheet and a grade book and stuff like that. And oh, Jacob Becker coming in. And so what I do is when we're done here, well, the recording has to be processed and it takes quite a while. I go ahead and look at the chat and take roll from that so that we don't have to have downtime, when you're actually in class. All right. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We have 6 presentations to do. We're under no immediate pressure to do them all today. I know that technically we should be starting module 3 next week. This is week 4, but the way I've kind of designed this, if we had to carry over, a couple of presentations or something to next week, we could do that. I felt like when we did this last time, the last presentation or so, everyone seemed really tired, and it almost seemed like, maybe I should have waited. So you got to let me know if you're starting to fade, because I've got these little tiny screens of you, and sometimes I can't tell that, you start looking like heroin addicts, and it's not your fault, it's just that, screen fatigue, I don't know. Okay, now, before we get into the presentations, a little bit of bookkeeping, right? A few of you failed to do the notes that are required of everyone. Okay, it's in the syllabus, and I explained it a couple times in class, because sometimes things in the syllabus, you look at it there and it doesn't quite make sense. That's why I talk about it in class. The purpose of those notes, right, is it's sort of multifaceted, right? In other words, part of it is I want you to actually go in and read. One way that I know you've read is if you're able to make summary notes. But also, I was explaining this in another class, those notes are useful to me because when I use literature here, what I do with this function, I can look at student reactions to the literature, and I can tell if there's a piece of literature that students really struggled with. It's just something about it. Stylistically, it was impenetrable, or it wasn't engaging, or it was 45 pages and no one in the 21st century can read more than 5, whatever it is, then I'll know and I'll get rid of that and try and find something to replace it with. So I need those too, but it is a requirement that you do. Okay, now I'm going to give you an amnesty on the notes for the first module. All right. I do score those, but that's just my business. I use that when your grades are borderline. If you've done well on your notes, and I can see those even if you can't, because you don't need to worry about that, then I'm liable to give you the higher of 2 grades if you're falling between grades, right? It's just something I use at my discretion. But those note entries that you put in there, they're valuable for you. They should be the thing you look at before you do your written assignment anyway. But even if you're not doing that, go and read the literature. It's college, you have to read. But also they do help me. They're useful for me. So I want you to please continue to do that. Now, a couple of you also did not submit, only a couple of you did not submit the first assignment, okay? If you look in the syllabus, and if you hearken back to other class discussions, right, a requirement of the class in order to pass is that you attempt every assignment, every single assignment, okay? So you're going to have to, it is your responsibility to make arrangements to meet with me, probably via Zoom or something, explain what's going on so that we can, if you missed it, we have to make a decision as to whether or not I'm going to allow you to do some sort of alternate assignment. Okay, but it's your responsibility, okay, not mine. You're all adults, and you can drink legally, and well, most of you, and drive cars, and go into debt, and go to the military, and do all kinds of interesting things. So I think if you can handle those adult decisions, you can decide that you need to complete assignments. Okay. I'm not wild about incompletes. My experience with people taking incompletes, particularly over the last 5 years, they're never the same. They never get back on the horse and catch up with where they were. And it even happens within a term. If you let like a first assignment go thinking, well, I'll go and I'll tell Bill that all my relatives died and I had terrible diseases and my house burned down. And then he'll let me do the assignment. but you do a crap job. So there's no point in doing that. Right? Stay current with the material. All right, now, are there any other procedural questions, or you should have your grades available on Moodle. Let me talk to you about those in case it's not clear, those grade values. It's out of 25, right? There are 25 points possible on each module's assignment. 22.5 to 25 is some sort of A, right? 20 to 22 is some sort of B. It's just percentages, right? 17.5 to 19.5 is some sort of C. 15 to 17 is a D. Anything below 15, rethink your life decisions. Okay, this is not that hard a class. All right, so are there questions about that? I didn't need to make comments of any length on everyone's paper. If you nailed the assignment, I just said good work or something like that, gave you your 92 or 94 or whatever, and moved on, percent. Where I did put comments on people who did less well, though, I would take a look at those before you do the next assignment. And then if you look at those comments and either they don't make sense or you want to know more specifically what you could do better, again, it is your responsibility to contact me, arrange to meet with me either during my regular office hour, noon to 1, or at some other time that we can both make, and we'll figure out what you can do better. I will say, though, I was pleased with the general quality of the essays. I thought that most of them were, how many of you, be honest now, if you didn't do it, don't tell me you did. How many of you looked at, if you go up to the top of the Moodle page, right, and you'll see there's a writing sample there. How many of you looked at that? Okay, about half of you. Well, except for those of you whose screens are off, I can't really tell, but I think that's helping. I think it gives you a little bit more of an idea, because I noticed in the introductory paragraph, a lot of you at least tried to be really specific about what you were going to do. That helps the reader a lot. Remember, you're not just writing for me. You're getting in the habit of writing in a way that's teaching people something. Okay, it's funny because I just had this conversation with my senior seminar class last night, but it's the same. All scholarly writing is the same, right? Write as though there's something you're trying to explain to the reader that the reader might not understand until you explain it. You're not being condescending, you're being helpful, okay? And you try to approach your assignments in that way. Don't try to be a stylist. Don't try to be clever. If you're naturally clever, it'll come out. If you're not, don't try. It's like, you know how people try to be funny who aren't? You can always tell when someone is trying to be funny and isn't funny. You know how you can always tell? Because they try to tell jokes, and jokes are almost never funny. If people are funny, they just sort of exude humor and you laugh. Okay. If they're not, that's not going to happen. It's the same thing with people who are clever or smooth or articulate on the page. It's not that it happens magically, but those skills have been honed by people who've spent a lot of time reading and writing. You can't fake that. And if you try, it really doesn't sound right. It just clunks. So try to avoid that. All right. Anything else before we get into the presentations? All right. I'm not sure exactly when the deadline is going to be for the next written assignment, because it's going to depend on whether or not we get all of the presentations done today, which I somehow suspect we won't, but I'm not, as you can tell, I'm hardly worried about it. All right. Because I'd rather have us take the time and get it done. Okay, so let's see. I want to just take these in order if we can. The first one is the airwaves, one. Who wants to start?
I can start. I forget who I'm with.
You're with me, Bennett. But yeah, you can start.
Okay, all right.
It's the article pretty much talks about the early days of radio in the United States, and how at the start of the radio, it was pretty much like how the start of the internet was, pretty much Wild West everywhere. So there was no government restrictions, and all you had to do to talk on the radio, listen to the radio, was have one. And it was kind of the first way that people across the country could get a sense of what was going on around the rest of the country and even the world in some situations.
Let me stop you for just a second, Carson. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
Most of the transceivers that people had really only, they were like the equivalent of a lower power transmitter today. Their effective broadcast range was usually really limited. So if you just had a regular transceiver, you weren't talking to the nation. Okay.
Well, you might not have had a transceiver, but you could have heard people talking,
No,
right?
but what I mean is you wouldn't unless they had a powerful, and a transceiver is just a transmitter receiver, right? Unless you had like a large power transmitter, okay, like a commercial radio station, your signal wasn't going to carry very far. It might not carry beyond the city limits. It might, it might be stopped by large buildings, certainly would be stopped by mountains. A lot of it still functioned the equivalent of line of sight, even though you can bounce signals and stuff. So radio as a medium, yes, it was a national and ultimately global medium. But for example, if you broadcast today from Medford, that signal's only going to carry about as far south as Central Point and about as far north as Hilt or something, probably. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, all you had to have to talk on the radio was a transmitter, obviously, and with no federal guidelines at this point, all you had to do was get a frequency, and a lot of times frequencies would get messed up and jambled with each other, which was one of the reasons why the federal government got involved, because big companies saw a money opportunity there. And whenever there's money, the big companies get involved. So they began lobbying the federal government to take control of the airwaves. And that's when Hoover started designating certain airwaves to certain people, but he wasn't very specific about it. So like you could still get them jambled all the time and have a hard time hearing what was being broadcasted. And then AT&T and a couple of the other big companies got in and kind of distinguished certain airwaves for certain peoples. And that's what opened up the door for like advertisements and money and more commercial radio. I don't know if you want to add anything right now, Bennett, or.
Yeah, I can hop in on that. Like he was saying, in 1927, Congress created the Federal Radio Commission, which was the power that was assigned to basically distribute the wavelengths to these different companies. And obviously, they're going to look for AT&T rather than some guy transmitting out of his garage, just talking about life. So they definitely, a quote from Robert McChesney on page 4 was, it was the use of public policy to create economics that favored the big players. So basically, they were trying to give away the wavelengths to companies that they knew were going to generate revenue that could go back towards the government also. And a lot of this got compared to the net neutrality thing, which was really popular, I think, in like 2018 was when that was all going on, which was basically the idea that internet companies and internet providers would be able to increase speeds for certain websites and then slow them down for others. So like, say Amazon could pay extra money so that you could view their website faster than like a nonprofit website, like say Wikipedia, who wouldn't be able to pay for people to see their product faster.
So you're saying that there's an apt comparison to be made between the commercialization and standardization of radio frequencies and the later notion that the bandwidth of the internet at least could be attempted to be regulated in a similar way that would favor concentrated commercial interests. Is that what I'm understanding?
Yeah.
That's what my biggest takeaway from the article was, is how similar it was to what was happening with the internet, because you had small people just like playing their high school band on the radio for fun, almost get run out of town. And you saw that was a fear with net neutrality. I don't really think it happened, but everyone was very concerned that all these small businesses that didn't have the same reach as big companies would get forced off the internet, essentially.
What about that? Should we be concerned about that? Because the other part of that is that one of the things that doesn't come out in this article, in fact, there's a couple of things in that narrative, but one of them is the idea that the attempt to standardize the bandwidth for radio, for terrestrial radio, wasn't just about profit. The idea was that these large networks, the biggest of which, of course, was NBC, were able to provide more regular and stable and professional quality programming, that they had more money to put into programming. They were more regular. They could be more regular in their schedules. Sponsors trusted them because early radio, there was no sponsorship. But by the time the FCC comes along, you both pointed out correctly, a big impetus of that was, sponsors will pay for this radio time so that their commercials can be there. But
yeah, I think sorry.
No, that's okay. I'm not trying to lead the discussion. It's just that, that was one of the other reasons. And it doesn't make it a good reason or a bad reason. One of the arguments for facilitating internet bandwidth for commercial companies is, we use Amazon a lot more than we use a lot of little small .orgs and stuff. There's a lot more traffic there, and those systems can be overloaded and can be strained. And if you give them more bandwidth, then people, customer service improves and things like that. I mean, I'm trying to take a position I hate taking, but it is an argument. What about?
Yeah, I take the other side because I think it's pretty dangerous, because you saw what just happened with Amazon. They're one of the main bandwidth providers, and they were just able to take away Parler, an app that had millions of people using it publicly.
Well, they didn't just take it away to take it away. They took it away because it was being used to propagate, pretty dark ideas. Now, you can say that censorship. Remember, censorship doesn't apply to private people.
Even if Parler was doing bad stuff, it's still an ideological standpoint that a company's taking to take.
It's not an ideological standpoint. It wasn't that these were conservatives. No one's trying to shut down Fox News, for example. And Fox News right now is actually an apologist for QAnon. Okay, they've just they've decided that because they need to get the ratings back. They're losing an audience to One American News and things like that. They're battling, for that corporate profit share. They used to be the #1 cable network, for news, so-called, in the country. Now they're like number 3.
Okay? I mean, I know I've definitely seen in the last few days Democratic politicians calling for Fox to be either censored or certain.
No, you haven't, Carson. No, you haven't. No, you haven't. You haven't heard anyone who is a Democratic elected official saying that Fox News should be taken off the air or should be censored in a way that wouldn't apply to other networks. No, you have not seen that.
Well, they've said it for OANN and Newsmax.
That's right, because that ain't Fox News. Okay. In other words, we don't have an absolute right to say everything we want to. We don't have that. And it's not because they're conservative. Remember, the same thing happened in the 60s with people on the left who were trying to reinvigorate, left wing, like far left, like Marxists, like KPFA in Berkeley, for example, had a lot of people who were socialists and Marxists and all that. They could do that because KPFA is listener supported. Okay. But, they also weren't advocating violence. There's a real difference when you start to advocate violence. That's not protected speech. It's not ideological. It's a question of criminality. Advocating violence is a crime.
I know. I'm just saying, I think that when you give the power to these huge companies, not everyone on Parler was advocating violence. And there are people on Twitter advocating violence. So then you're choosing one side.
You're not choosing one side. You're choosing the side that advocates violence. That's not a side, that's a crime. Okay, it's like saying, drug dealers ought to be able to use America's streets. They're providing a valuable commodity. No, whether we like it or not, it's a crime. And until it becomes not a crime, it's a crime. So I don't want to really go down that road. There's a better argument to be had with respect to media and bias that we can have in its proper time. But you're right that, there were a lot of people who were using sites like Parler who weren't, advocating violence or overthrow or insurrection or any of that nonsense. That's true. They'll find other places to go because the things they were doing are not crime. They're not crimes. They're not criminal. Okay. So we have this, let's just please be careful about that. I understand that there is a widespread belief not at all substantiated by fact, that mainstream media have a far left bias. That has never been true. It's not true today. First of all, when it comes to journalism, you can't afford the luxury of that kind of bias because people will not trust you. One of the problems that we have is we're conflating, we're beginning to conflate commentary, which by definition is biased, with journalism, which strives to be objective. Now, the challenge for us now is, where can you actually find journalism on television? Almost nowhere. You got to go to newspapers. And most of you, I would bet none of you read a regular newspaper. Okay. And it's just, that's the thing. But you can't tell me that the New York Times is left wing. It's just factually incorrect. It's nonsense. I mean, remember, left wing is socialism and communism. Why would a profitable for-profit corporation want to be communist? It doesn't make sense. And also, if you look at the content, the front page of the New York Times is not strikingly different from the front page of the Wall Street Journal. And the Wall Street Journal is owned by Rupert Murdoch, and it's pro-business and pro-Republican in its editorial section. Editorials are commentary. Okay, try to make the distinction between, first of all, between journalism and, you know, people posting. That's not journalism. That's just people bloviating. Okay. Those people bloviating in the United States have a remarkable bandwidth of freedom to say stupid things. What they don't have is the right to incite violence. That's a crime. Now, you know, they have a right to traffic in conspiracies and all kinds of things like that, so long as they're not engaged in criminal activity. That's the law, and it holds up remarkably well. Okay, so I understand that a lot of people right now have a lot of misinformation about what's going on in the United States with respect to news, journalism. That's because almost none of you are exposed to authentic journalism anymore. It doesn't have a comfortable home on the internet. We'll come back to that in its place, but I think you made some very important comparisons, though, between the problematic nature of radio and the corporate decision to rationalize it on a for-profit basis to the benefit of large organized economic interests. That is clearly, as both of you pointed out, exactly what the idea is with, you know, having selective access to bandwidth, you know, kind of pay to play. That is perfectly legitimate. It doesn't need to be, and is not, in fact, an ideological argument unless you're a Marxist and you see that as the triumph of capitalism. You know, otherwise, it's not about ideology. It's about profit. And those things are not very often the same thing. Okay. Any questions about the Airwaves article or anything? Yeah, Renee.
So I just had, it's a little bit of a question, a little bit of a comparison. So everyone knows like Disney Plus and Netflix right now, and the new kind of apps that are bringing shows to their platforms and making deals and like taking things off of other things,
Yeah.
and really privatizing entertainment. Is that something that's come out of first like the radio being subsidized and then moving into the net neutrality, or is that just something that would have happened on its own?
That's something that always has been the case. Newspapers are privately owned. The original radio stations were privately owned. Very few of them were, you know, we don't have the equivalent of the BBC, right? A government-owned kind of thing. Television stations are, you know, one of the most powerful media ever developed was television in its day. It was the first medium of that throwaway that was strictly for profit. Almost none of the bandwidth was set aside for what was then called educational television. Okay, so it's always been in the hands of private enterprise. More than that, one of the things that does, the other thing I was going to mention that doesn't show up in that article, if you look at the charter of the FRC and then the FCC, one of the things that people always overlook, okay, first of all, when you're talking about ATT, you are talking about a massive military industrial corporation called Westinghouse, which has been absolutely present at the creation of the modern military industrial complex in the United States, okay? It was always involved in that. It was probably that and RCA were the most decisive players in that push. So part of this is what I think gosh, I'm trying to think. Carson, I think it was you who was trying to talk about advantages to government. You know, like, yeah, part of it was, yeah, government revenue. But beyond government revenue, it's the idea of the potential for government control. Remember, newspapers are not regulated by the state, not in any way at all. They're subject to libel law, right? But they're not there's no regulatory agency in any state government or the United States that has the power to censor a newspaper. Okay. So the idea here is this medium was going to be so powerful that we needed to find ways where we could control it and shut it down if we needed to for military industrial purposes. Another thing about it was the original board of directors had to include someone from the United States military, typically the United States Navy. A lot of people don't realize that. That's important because it shows that this is a technology that had fundamental geostrategic power and relevance. And to just leave that in the hands of people like us was a terrible thing to do. So that the media are not democratic in that sense. They were never intended to be. And Renee, if that's what you're asking, the answer is no, they were never intended to be. Okay. This is the problematic nature of the internet. You see, we're doing this right now. When we're done, I'm going to post this on YouTube. I get comments from people. Somehow they find this. I don't know. Okay, they got to get a life if this is the best they can find on YouTube. But it's like, again, it's like I actually am running a crummy little TV station. Okay. That's democratic and that's dangerous because democracy is dangerous. It's a dangerous thing. It's what's not coming out in a lot of the coverage of what happened at the Capitol. You know, looking past the violence, there are very real grievances that drive people to those kinds of demonstrations. And you don't have to agree with them to understand, man, you know what, from their point of view, they got a grievance. I don't agree with them, but they got a grievance. Okay, you're not hearing that. Now, that's what a lot of people perceive as bias. The problem is you're not hearing about it from the commentators on CNN and MSNBC. But it, you know, you will hear about it when, you know, when people are interviewed and allowed to express those grievances. That was pretty much the case right up until the 6th. So it's the truth of media and bias is much more interesting than just, well, it's a bunch of left-wing elitists. First of all, left-wing elitists almost don't exist except in places like Ashland. And they're not left-wing. I'm far to the left of these clowns in Ashland because I have compassion and they haven't. All right. So this ideological argument kind of falls flat. But I understand we're going to come back to this because it is something that recurs. But Renee raises a great point here. All right. Understand this as a private power struggle to control these incredibly potentially influential media. Even if all you can do is influence people to buy stuff they can't afford and don't need. That is an extraordinary power in capitalism. So yeah, the private sector ownership and control of this is significant, okay? And don't get me wrong, there's bias everywhere. Hell, you can say I'm biased. What you can't say is I'm teaching you my biases, okay? I mean, most of you don't even know what my politics are, okay? Which is good. All right, let's go on to propaganda. This is your propaganda kids. Who wants to start that?
I had one question.
Oh, I'm
you-
sorry.
just
Go
really
ahead.
quickly. I was just curious, in terms of like the timeline globally, was the US way out in front in like this sort of power struggle in terms of radio? Were there other governments that had already standardized and become involved in their radio scenes?
Well, yes. Britain was developing radio actually in some ways before the United States was, because Marconi took his technology and his knowledge to Britain first. They were already building what would become the BBC. The difference was Britain has much more of a history of centralized power. The United States at that time did not. Okay, and so the real difference is kind of what Renee suggested. It's the inordinate power of private capital in the development of radio and television. It wasn't government subsidies. There was relatively little of that. The Corporation for Public Broadcasting doesn't control much in the way of resources at all. There aren't any of these PBS stations and things like that that could support themselves just on what they get from the CPB. they need viewers or listeners to, that's why they do the pledge drives and stuff. Otherwise, they're out of business. Now, in a way, that is economic democracy. If you think about it, it's like, no, we're not going to have commercials. Okay. And they have very little, if any. You'll have little spots sometimes, like a 10-second spot from, it's usually some really repellent company, that traffics in chemicals or something abhorrent, that all the delicate flowers of the left are horrified by. But that's because the viewers are sitting there saying, you know what, Vivian, we should send them another check. Get my checkbook. And they send them a check, All right. So, but the difference is, Dylan, is the involvement of the private sector overwhelmingly dominating that. And that's neither bad nor good. It's just that it's different. But what I think Carson was pointing out, it might have been Bennett, was the importance of the government entering into I don't want to say collusion, but into a very cozy relationship with these powerful corporations. I'm sorry, Brett, you had what looks like a question.
Yeah.
There you are.
And so, I understand that it wasn't the government seeking to profit by regulating radio, because there's really no profit in regulation.
No.
But how do I want to say this? So because of those large corporations' ability and the money to lobby individual politicians, to what extent do you think that those two, why my brain's not working today, those two competing ideas, you could view it as though the government is enriching itself, even though it's individuals who are working within the government enriching themselves by creating legislation to regulate the radio? And what influence did that have on the whole situation?
Oh, I think that was the whole situation. Yeah, that's kind of what I'm trying. You said it probably better than I did, was that it's what became that iron triangle relationship. In other words, the executive branch is the authority that regulates broadcast media, right? The FCC is part of the executive branch, but it was created and is funded by Congress. Members of Congress are created and funded by campaign donations. If you're a lobbyist and you can guarantee a certain amount of money in campaign time, you've just bought access. It isn't necessarily that elected official is going to do exactly what you want. Sometimes they don't. But what you have bought is you're going to be first in line for access. There is no question, Brett, that AT&T, Westinghouse, RCA, these companies that were massive in their time, right? They weren't like Standard Oil, but they were big and growing and influential. They were pouring lots of money in various ways into campaigns. They were already influential people. They had solid connections with the military because they had been the people building the hardware for, early radio and later radar for World War I and World War II, right? So they had immediate access to Congress. As a consequence of that, they were using regulatory authority to their benefit. It's like when we look at the creation of the Interstate Commerce Commission. A lot of people wonder, well, if corporations were so powerful, coming out of the Gilded Age and everything, how did we get the Interstate Commerce Commission? How did we get, laws that outlawed monopolies? Look at the way those laws are written and ask yourself, when have they ever really operated to the obvious detriment of large, powerful companies? How about virtually never? They know exactly what they're doing. Their lawyers write the original drafts of the legislation. So the lobbying power, Brett, is absolutely there. It's absolutely there. Now, the government, in the form of revenue gathering, is going to get something from that, okay? But that's not their primary motive. The primary motive is more like what I think you were suggesting, which is the individual members of the House and Senate who sit on these key committees are the ones who are going to benefit, especially if they say, oh, well, we've got this new regulatory authority, all right? So I can go back to my constituents, and maybe I come from a very conservative district with a lot of people who are, they're very religious, and religion is a very important part of their lives. And they're saying, we want you to do something about all this garbage that's coming out on TV. They can say, you know what? I was one of the people who created this new regulatory authority. If you file a complaint, then they'll make these people stop. So there were a lot of advantages there. Is that where you were going?
Yeah, basically, where it's not necessarily the government, which is, so many things, as it is the people who constitute the government, the individuals who are able to take money and exert influence through government regulation.
It can be. Yeah, it absolutely can be. And with something this important, it's going to be. It's absolutely going to be. Another example of this would be when the National Rifle Association was first created, okay, that was a Northern institution. And it wasn't about, you know, it wasn't what it is now. One of the things that the NRA realized was they had tremendous leverage when they sort of made common cause, not so much with gun owners as with gun dealers and manufacturers, because that's where the money is. Okay. Now, again, they've got a perfectly legal right to do that. Okay. But that organization is not the sort of populist gun owners organization it was, for example, when my grandfather was a member of the NRA, because he was a sportsman and a hunter and things like that. And he was also he was a deputy sheriff for a while. So, you know, he had this notion of responsible gun ownership and teaching people gun safety and stuff like that. The NRA isn't that they don't do that. Their primary reason for existing right now is to make common cause, usually with Republicans, occasionally with conservative Democrats, to advance the interests of gun owners, but more so of gun manufacturers and gun dealers. Yeah, somebody had their hand. Oh, wait, Renee, yeah, sorry.
Don't they also have their own TV station now too?
Well, they have had, it hasn't done very well. Yeah, they have it. They had a network, a cable network, but it hasn't really done all that well. That's not always a fair indication that the programming is good or bad. It's just that I think a lot of people just couldn't find it. You know, I think if it's cable, your cable provider has to have it, and there are a lot of reasons why it might not have succeeded. It doesn't appear to have succeeded though. But certainly there are a lot of dues-paying members of the NRA. It's not it's a wealthy lobbying organization, you know. All right, anything else? Do you see why I had a feeling we might not get all these done today? I'd rather air it out and go into more detail here. But also, I'm not trying to change anybody's mind, but I am from time to time going to take a few minutes to try to disabuse you of some common errors that people have in terms of assumptions about who controls what and to what end, okay? But the main thing I want you to think about is that difference, and it really matters in early radio, and it really matters with the internet. The difference between people who are just opinion and commentary and people who are trying to be responsible journalists. And part of it is generational. Most of you have seen very little actual journalism in your lives. It's almost dead. Okay. There was a time when that was an admirable and to some people honorable profession. It may still be as far as journalism is concerned, but it's not the same as commentary. That was always clearly labeled, given a specific section in television broadcasts, on the radio, and everywhere else. Everyone knew, oh, there were people like Paul Harvey, commentators on radio. And you'd know, okay, this is Paul Harvey's view of America. And you'd figure out pretty soon that Paul Harvey's kind of conservative and he's got a certain kind of folksy view of America. And that's cool. And he's got a perfect, but no one confused that for the news. No one. Now almost everyone does. And that's become a problem. All right. Can we move on? Or are there other questions or comments? Looks like we're ready to move on. Are we? Who wants to go?
I can take the first swing at the
Okay.
next one here.
All right. Sorry for the clap. Just making notes.
Okay. So this one is on this is your propaganda kids. Obviously, as the title suggests, it's about propaganda focused on children in World War I. World War I was the first war which propaganda aggressively encouraged children to think about war and to take action for its, as the article says, prosecution.
Okay, can I ask you, Nolan?
Okay.
Take your time on this, okay? When you make a statement like that, try and help us understand why would that be the case? Why was World War I the first of that kind of war? Because that's a great point.
So, I mean, on that point, so in the article, it's stated that all wars depend on being able to recruit the imagination of the young. I mean, I don't know why this would be the first war that they focuses on that. I don't, the article kind of made it pretty clear that was its assumption, though.
Well, let's think about it. What kind of technology do we have that we might not have had, say, in the Civil War? For some reason, this war is different. Remember, first of all, let's be clear. U.S. entry into the First World War was overwhelmingly unpopular. When Woodrow Wilson was running for presidency, he was pretty much promising that he would not involve the United States in a foreign war, even though we now know he had every intention of bringing the United States into that war. He knew it wasn't popular. He knew that it was a loser as a campaign issue. So what happened? Something happened that changed the way people felt about entry into the war, because it was never wildly popular, but we did have a draft. A lot of people were drafted, a lot of people volunteered, a lot of people went over there and fought, and a lot of people died. So what technology did we have that we didn't have in the Civil War?
So as Jared just said, I guess radios.
Well, we didn't really. That's the thing. Radio is really after the First World War. Radio is developed much the way that heavier than aircraft flight is developed during that war. As a consequence of that war, what would have been the development of heavier than aircraft was accelerated geometrically because of the necessity of war. The same thing was true of radio. Radio was just kind of an experiment people were kicking around until we got into the war. Remember that we were still using semaphore and things like that to direct artillery and things like that. People were still standing up and using flags and stuff, or they were using lights to signal from ships and things like that. I mean, when my father was in the Navy in the Second World War, he was taught semaphore and signals in addition, and he was a radio operator, because there was always that concern, well, what happens when the radio goes down? He was in the South Pacific. Radio transmissions were problematic. So radio wasn't quite what we had, but what we've talked about a lot of the breakthroughs of the late 19th century. We had normalized magazines, periodical publications. We had this massive proliferation of newspapers, but we had targeted magazines, regular periodicals of special interest, including of special interest to young boys and girls, that we hadn't really had during the Civil War. Literacy rates were much higher by 1914 or 1911 than they had been in 1850. See, the culture's changing, society's changing. Okay, so just you go ahead, but think about that as you're going on, because this education of the young is important.
Okay, I mean, I see what you're saying there, because I mean, my next point was this article really focused on 3 private magazines or publications. Those 3 were American Boy, which appealed to boys 9 to high school, St. Nicholas, which was boys and girls age 5 to high school, and then the Rally, which the paper or the article kind of made a big deal that it actually didn't start publication until after the U.S. entered the war, but it appealed specifically to girls. And then there was also a government magazine called the National School Service, but it was started for to research propaganda techniques for children, and they directed that towards educators and influential adults.
Hey, think about that. We had, at a time, remember, when the United States government was very small, we had people using the government and the legitimacy of the state in order to research ways to propagandize children. Does that sound like the United States? Does that sound like a free country? That's what war does. And that's one of the things that war does. You know, because you come to believe that it's a necessity. And once you convince yourself it's a necessity, the notions of civil liberties and things like that very quickly fall by the wayside. War will do that. Violence can do that. Okay, that's a really good observation. Georgia, do you want to pick it up from there? Are you doing? I think you're doing this, aren't you? Yeah, you are. Are you ready? You give us a good start.
Yeah, sorry. What I found like a lot of multiple like interesting points in this, like especially like quotes Like I found like from time to time again, like in the article it was brought up that like war was kind of like a game in a sense, and like they would also like reference like football a lot. Like they mentioned this one like image of like a football player throwing a football, and then like side by side there's like a soldier throwing a grenade. And just what I got from this article was like trying to form words. My brain's not correctly working today, but I found it to be very manipulative in a sense, because it was talking about, you know, like they would reach out to little boys and like telling them, you know, you should be honorable, like if you serve your country, like you're moral and respectful and stuff, and if not, it's the same dishonor as like someone avoiding the draft or something.
Okay, now again, that's the thing. Now tell us why that's important. What precedent does that establish in terms of, again, remember, this is overwhelmingly private publications for profit. Okay, why is that important?
Well, when I kind of look at history during this time, I feel like America wanted to seem like it was the best place to be, or like kind of create this like hero ideal of being like the savior, and kind of why we entered the war super late.
Well, we entered the war super late because we still had some vestiges of democracy in terms of culture. And the vast majority of American men and women did not want the United States involved in what they saw as an old world war, that it had nothing to do with us. And of course, directly it didn't. You could argue. But remember, we've already talked about the Spanish-American War. The Spanish-American War forever turns a page and starts a new chapter for the United States as an empire, as an aspirant to empire. We are a hemispheric hegemon. We are aspiring to global power, to empire, okay? It was that compelled us to become involved in World War I, because the concern is we now have to do what Britain can't do. We have to be that counterweight to extremism in Europe, because Britain is too weak. It can't do it by itself. Because the old theory was balance of power.
I just have a quick question. Were they expecting there to be a World War II when World War I was happening?
I don't know.
Like, were they predicting? Like, were they like predicting it? Because there's this one thing I found interesting. I think it was page 1 or 2 of the article, where they were talking about how they're trying to prepare these children of World War I to become the leaders of like World War II.
Okay, what they mean there is a lot of this is a good, I'm glad you mentioned that. That's a great point. And that one was way in the back of my head. Now it's in the front. One of the assumptions that becomes baked into this view of America is war is inevitable. But that's okay, because war is honorable. When you are as honorable as we are, you have to fight. In other words, we still believe that, you know, that the reason why we have the military that we have is to defend democracy. Well, American democracy is not threatened in any way at all from outside. Economically, yeah, we're challenged by China. We're undermined by Russia, but really, even Russia, it's a third-rate power. The only thing they can do is make us trip over our own feet. Okay. But, you know, the purpose of the military in a large power is not to protect democracy. It's to project power. Okay. We're not exporting democracy. Show me anywhere in the world where we actually exported a democracy that had never existed. That's not why we fight. But if you read these things, now it may be why individual men and women fight. Okay, I mean, that kind of patriotism is often that idea of, look, man, there are certain kinds of freedoms we have. My life's a lot better than my dad's was. That's worth fighting for. That's different. But I'm talking about the policy of the government. And to that extent, the entry into the propagating of that policy by these private publishing companies is, we're going to have to fight. because it wasn't we want to rule the world, it's we should. And ultimately that became we must. If we don't, it will be Russia, it will be Germany, it will be Italy, it will be China, it will be whoever. Without ever asking, well, wait a minute, is that really the only way to do this? So that's what they mean by, preparing children during World War I to be the leaders or fighters, really, of World War II, is the idea that when you enter into that phase of great power, which we did arguably by the time of the Spanish-American War, where you displace an old world empire, but you don't end colonialism, you seize those territories as your own. And in fact, you then turn on, in the case of the Philippines, the very people that helped defeat, the enemy. They then become the enemy, the people who fought alongside you. Okay, that's what great powers do. It's not about morality. It's about power. Okay, so that's what they're really talking about, is people had to grow up understanding whoever they are, they're out there. The barbarians are at the gate. And if we don't stay in a constant state of armed readiness, they're going to come in and overrun us. Okay. No one propagates that view of the world in Sweden or Switzerland or, I don't know, even Japan, really, until recently, with North Korea fooling around with nuclear weapons and stuff. I mean, that's not a common message. That is an internal dialogue that's had, really, it's more a monologue with great powers. That if you look at Britain, you see the same narrative. If you look at Russia during its imperial period before the Soviet Union and during the Soviet Union, you find the same message. In that sense, there was no difference between the United States and Mother Russia or the fatherland in Germany. It wasn't that we're Nazis. That's not what I'm saying. But there is a domestic propaganda that must be maintained, and a narrative that must be sustained, so that when we go to war, we don't have an internal uprising. This was the problem with Vietnam. We didn't want to fight. Americans historically don't want to fight. We don't mind fighting each other. We're like a family. That's the way I grew up. My brother would kick the shit out of me until someone came along and threatened me, and then he'd kill him. I mean, that's the way we are. I mean, we shoot each other over parking spaces, but if anybody were to invade us, we'd all strap it on and kill them. I mean, we have that ethos as America. Oh, we hope we would, I suppose. We'd protect the family, in this case, the country. I don't know. But that's the kind of volatility you're playing with when you're talking about. I like the way Nolan said it. That notion of the imagination of the young. That you tap into that imagination that really only exists in young people, where life is still kind of a fantasy. And if you can introduce into that not only the inevitability, but the uplifting nobility and virtue of war, and the ethos of sacrifice and selflessness and all that. Because the other thing is, how much discussion do you hear about freedom and individuality and things like that? How much do you hear about the right to dissent? You don't. Not in those publications, you don't. I know, because somewhere in some box somewhere, going all the way back to when I was studying media as an undergraduate, I have a couple of copies of a couple of those magazines. And it's just like startling. They're like, holy shit, my grandfather was reading this, wow. Right? So what do you think? I mean, why didn't somebody just come along and say, hey, you can't do that, you're poisoning our children's minds?
So I'm sorry, say that question again.
Yeah, why is there a sense that these magazines could just do this? They could get into your children's heads and teach them to be killers, or teach them to be warriors, or teach them to be whatever, and that there was virtue in that, even though they weren't fighting for themselves and they weren't fighting for their families. I'm trying to stay in the theme that's being developed in the piece, which is they're just cannon fodder. But they make it sound like a virtuous sacrifice. It isn't that it isn't. It's that war is so much more than that. Even though most people I know Like for my generation, it would have been Vietnam. By the time they got in country, they weren't thinking about the flag when they were under fire. They just wanted to get their buddies home. They just wanted to get out of there and get home. And so they would do whatever they needed to do. But it wasn't, at that point, it wasn't patriotism, it was survival. And I've been shot at, but I've never been in combat. I can't imagine that you could sustain that notion of the virtue of sacrifice and everything when you are under sustained fire, the kind of artillery and trench warfare that we saw in World War I, where you're afraid to go to sleep because the rats will start getting you. You know, that's war. And there's no virtue in that. You know, not the kind that they were doing in terms of, again, triggering into what Nolan pointed out as the imagination of the young. They didn't allow the imagination of the young to contemplate the fact that people had to find different ways to kill the rats in the trenches because they were forbidden by their officers to shoot them because it could give away their position and use up spare ammunition. Look at the pictures of World War I and look at how many times you will see a little rack off to one side stacked with rats. I mean, what do you think they were eating when they couldn't get supplies? You know, that's war. Okay. And again, it's what human beings do this. It's not judgment, but you know, the reality of it is it isn't a game. It's not like football. I'm sorry. I played football and I survived. It's not that bad. You know, I mean, I played football and laughed. I had a good time getting the crap. You know, it was just like, shit, look at that fucking little guy run. You know, it was silly. It was ridiculous. That's not war. But Georgia points out, it's like, yeah, they'd show you, hey, you're going to be just as heroic as the star quarterback on the football field. And isn't that great? Well, no, maybe not. You know, it's also not what you're taught when you're in the military. You know, you need to be taught how to survive. You don't worry too much about whether or not people admire you and all that. There's things you got to do. You know, it's business. It's work. Yeah.
Tell me if I'm going in the wrong direction, but towards the end of the article, I found that it was talking about like how it was the propaganda was like teaching them obedience, like in American Boy. It was like you're either one type of person. There's only two. It's either American or a traitor. So it's kind of teaching them because like there's a lot of immigration around this time, and I feel like they instilled fear into them of like, if you're not American, then you're a terrible person. Not a terrible person, but like you're not as like strong or powerful.
Well, no, I think you can go ahead and say it. The idea is if you're insufficiently patriotic to make those sacrifices, you're not American. And if you're not American, we don't want you here. You know, I mean, you still hear that theme today. You know, you still hear it. You know, people will disagree with you, and instead of saying, sorry, man, I disagree with you, they're like, you're a traitor. You're an enemy of the people. We're hearing rhetoric today that we haven't heard since World War I, in many cases, domestically. Even World War II was a bit different, you know.
I guess that would be my answer to your question of like why parents would just allow this, because I think it was all rooted in fear. They didn't want everyone to look at them a different way, or
no one wants that. I mean, one of the things that I can't really recommend it, but if you read Tocqueville and you read Democracy in America, he's writing in approximately 1835. And even then he's writing, on the one hand, this country has some of the broadest spectrum of permissiveness in terms of the Bill of Rights protections, free expression and free association and assembly and things like that. On the other hand, he'd never encountered a place characterized by such stifling conformity. Yeah, I mean, there is that. And part of that is those waves of immigration. I mean, every time a new generation of immigrants comes in, we got to find a way to assimilate them. You know, we don't want them being aloof. But on the other hand, they're foreign and they're different, and they got to do it our way. Oh, Julian, I'm sorry, you had your hand up. I didn't see that.
That's all right. I sort of wanted to connect it to the article I presented 2 weeks ago. It reminds me of the publication that the article Ira talked about, and it seems like the people who were influenced by that magazine and stuff like that during that time would be the parents of the like kids during World War I.
Yeah.
And that they had the same ideals essentially given to them by this periodical.
Well, you got to figure that at least in the case of smaller children, they're not going down to the store and buying their own magazines. You know, I mean, their parents might give them the money. Yeah, you can go get a copy of that, or here, I got you a magazine. That, as often as not, it was the parents choosing that. And again, it wasn't like they were these warped parents. I mean, that was the view then. Remember too that we've gone through this incredibly volatile, destructive period in America that dates from approximately 1850 to 1890, that takes us from the Civil War all the way through the Gilded Age and a massive financial collapse and, you know, a brief contraction of the middle class at a time when the middle class was steadily expanding. I mean, these were scary times for a lot of people. In addition to this, things were being industrialized, you know, things were being mechanized, and old ways of doing things, traditional ways of doing things, traditional ways of farming, traditional ways of delivery, traditional ways of travel. And, you know, a couple of you mentioned, you know, well, radio came along. So yeah, everything was being compressed, everything was being modernized, all the traditional values were being challenged. So it was quite natural that people, some of them would want to, can we slow this down? That's what the Scopes monkey trial was about in the 1920s. Part of it was just this state of shock that science and technology had so betrayed our trust in World War I by wreaking such horrific hell on the species and destroying much of Europe and a large swath of young American men, and also women who went over as nurses and things. But and so they were like that notion of the old time religion. Let's just go back. In fact, a lot of people forget. Most people believe that as a consequence of the Scopes trial, existing laws that forbade the or sanctioned the teaching of evolution were taken away. Scopes lost that trial. And in the wake of that, throughout the 30s, a number of other states, most of them in the South, right, passed similar laws. This was a war against science. Okay. Again, you think you're seeing these things for the first time, with whether it's climate science or, you know, a more scientific understanding of sexuality or of anything else, you know, the effects of media, whatever it is. This has been going on for a long time. Because every time there's a significant transformation of technology, somebody's going to get hurt by that. Somebody's traditional values are going to get stepped on. Somebody who's been doing something a certain way, they've relied on that, and it allows them to sleep at night and get up refreshed in the morning. Suddenly that's gone. Okay? That's going on in this country right now. It's just that nobody seems to want to talk about it, because a lot of times the people it's affecting don't seem to be very appealing. You know, they're not the most articulate or the best educated or whatever. And so we think there's something wrong with them. Well, no, there's something wrong with where they're trying to live, transforming to a place they don't recognize anymore. Now you can say, well, look, man, the future's happening to everybody. Yeah, it's easy if you're caught up in the tide of the future and you're surfing it well. But if you're not and you're trying to resist it, it's drowning you. This was happening for a lot of people in the early 20th century. Things they had relied on were being challenged in fundamental ways. That's still happening. And that's always going to be played out in our media, always. And sometimes it's going to be weaponized. And that's when we see things like propaganda, okay? So do you see why I would assign a reading like this, though? In other words, nothing's new. This has been going on for a long time, okay? Yeah, that was good. That was interesting. I hope I didn't take that over too much, but there's a lot here I want to make sure you get. Are there other questions or reactions to or comments about that particular piece? I have to look to make sure nobody's doing that weird raised hand thing. All right, then I'm not going to worry about it. Can we do, what do you think? You want to do 3 today and then do the other 3 next week? Have a little shorter day? I don't know about you, but I'm kind of brain dead. It's been a tough week. It's only Thursday. But I also want to make sure we have enough time to air these out. I think 3 is probably good, because we're going a little deeper. All right, let's see. Reporters. Propagandists. Okay, let's see. Let's see. I just saw, damn it. I just saw. You guys are bouncing around on the screen. It's like acid flashback. Damn it, don't do that, man. So let's see. This is Andrea and who else? Is Dallas here?
Me,
Yeah, and who else? Where's Dallas?
Dallas.
Oh, there you are. You don't have a picture, so I couldn't find you. Okay, who wants to start?
I could start.
Okay.
Okay, so yeah, I read The Reporters and Willing Propagandists. And this reading kind of just like discusses how hard it was for journalists to kind of like find the best way to serve their audiences, because we have to remember that during this time period, there was a lot of censorship, and censorship is basically the suppression of free speech. And they also kind of had to worry about patriotism and just trying to sound as patriotic as they could. It was kind of hard because news is not necessarily like always positive. So they tried to figure out, am I gonna like reveal the harsh and dark truths, or should I just report both the good and the bad? It was kind of difficult for them to kind of figure out that balance. And patriotism in the newspaper usually struck popular approval as well. And it was just really hard for them to figure out how patriotic they could be, especially if they were like trying to be honest and say something that could come off as like criticism to the armed forces or the government. And American journalists on the Western Front did kind of see it as their duty to support the government and as well as the military in fighting the Central Powers. And often enough, criticism did actually kind of help to better the nation in the end, because if you're just hearing positive things all the time, then where are you going to improve from? And this was also very much an issue in the Spanish-American War as well. And the military and government were also like afraid of the press because they thought they were like a potential threat to the battlefield security. And kind of also something that like the press kind of had to like worry about is they had to worry about not revealing too much information about the military, because like you can't reveal everything. There's secrets that have to be secrets. So that was kind of a concern as well. So basically just a lot of, not really a fine line of what they could say and what they couldn't say. And back in this era, it was especially important to kind of remain patriotic because Americans just in general wanted the best image of themselves to be revealed to the public. And it was just, it's extremely important to like, kind of like have like constructive criticism because, I mean, that's how you better as a nation. And that was kind of something that really didn't become more of a thing until around 1918. They believe that around 1918,
we gotta leave your partner with something to talk about. Okay, that's really good. But before we do that, you covered a lot of ground. Is it clear to everybody? Some of you may not have had a chance to read this yet. We're still in World War I here. You helped us by saying the Western Front, but there still are going to be some people who might not connect that to World War I. But one of the things I wanted to ask you before we move on, and Dallas, if you want to jump in on this, feel free. You said a couple of times that there was this dilemma of being good journalists, but also being patriotic. Well, what does it mean? Why should there be a difference between being a good journalist and being patriotic?
Well, personally, I believe that.
Oh, wait a minute. We're interested in personal beliefs. Try and generalize this, okay? I mean, I think I know what your personal views are. That's okay.
But as a generalization, I think that people thought that to be a good journalist, you had to protect the nation and be patriotic. And I think that, I mean, yeah, obviously, like, it's a good journalist is someone who reveals like everything and like the good and the bad. But I think to be a good journalist in this time period, you really had to be pro-war and also defend the nation and be patriotic.
Okay, one of the things, and Dallas, you may want to talk about this. One of the reasons why I assigned this and the one on the so-called Murrow Boys is that whatever we may talk about with respect to a constitutionally protected right to free speech and a free press suddenly starts to ice up when we're at war, okay? And it's for the very reason that Andrea pointed out, because then the journalist is really hard put to, in other words, to advance the interests of the nation, because that's the journalist's home, presumably, while still being honest and balanced in the coverage of something like war, without giving away tactical or strategic information, without overwhelmingly perhaps undermining the morale of the forces, as clearly happened in Vietnam. Okay, it is a real challenge. And it's something we're still struggling with. I mean, the obvious nadir of that would be Vietnam. Okay. But Dallas, do you want to pick up from there?
Yeah, okay, so I was going to talk about how, so on the war front, a lot of American journalists were struggling with, especially French censorship, and a little bit of British, but mostly French, who were cutting out large parts of the story of things that they saw as like arbitrary facts that weren't really gonna like tell secrets to the Germans. They were more of like things like accomplishments of the British and France and Allied forces that they thought could be patriotic propaganda, which in like 1917 propaganda didn't have the same like negative connotation that it did today. It was more of just like trying to sway people to your side of the cause.
That's a great point. Do you know where the term propaganda was borrowed from? Religion. It was the notion of, with religion, it's the notion of propagating. You know, it's a kind of botanical term, you know, right? To propagate a species means to spread it and allow it to grow and spread, right? And so the idea with religion is you're propagating the faith, okay? So when people started using the term propaganda, in the same way that we took the term charisma, which originally a charismatic leader was someone who could inspire the faith in people and reinvigorate that faith in terms of their presence and their manner and their speaking and everything. We now use that politically as well. The same thing, you're right though, it's a great point. Propaganda, like what we saw in the This Is Your Propaganda Kids article, wasn't then considered to be the kind of intrusive Orwellian thing that most people now think of it to be, okay? So that's a great point. I'm glad you brought that up. Does that make sense, by the way? You know, the concepts themselves evolve over time. Okay.
Okay, so at this time,
go ahead.
The American Expeditionary Force created a division, to the censorship division of the General Staff, to kind of centralize all of the American reporters who were overseas covering the war. They had to take an oath to not reveal any military secrets, troop positioning, where divisions were staying at the time, anything that could hurt our ability to fight the war. And they all their correspondence had to be censored. Personal letters were censored by a different division, but any official correspondence had to be looked at by not only American censors, but also the French as well. And any failure to comply with this could result in their suspension, dismissal, or detention by the military. And loss of, so one example of this is one reporter, Haywood Brown, actually broke AEF guidelines and sent home letters regarding military loss that he blamed on French politicians. So he believed that because he was not mentioning the AEF, it did not need to be under censorship guidelines. But the division chief, he believed that it was more of a breach of trust. And so Brown lost his credentials, but he didn't really mind it because he believed that a matter of personal honor shouldn't stop him from performing his duty to the public.
Which is part of what, Andrea, what you were talking about, and how individual reporters sometimes, even under the constraints imposed by the military for tactical and strategic reasons, every individual reporter kind of had to balance that out in his or her own, well, I guess almost all of them were men at that time, but they had to, you know, figure out, how do I thread this needle so that I kind of keep the home front informed and I'm honest about this, and yet I don't undermine morale at home, I don't undermine the morale of the troops, and I don't give away the kinds of things that might prove to be decisive in ultimately bringing this thing to an end, presumably to the advantage of, you know, the Americans and their allies, right? Again, this is not a one-off. This has not only has war been a fairly constant part, or military action been a pretty constant part of American history throughout the 20th century. And we have by far the largest and most powerful military, okay? We spend more on the military than any other country, including, by the way, China, okay? We also have the world's largest economy, but even proportionally, we spend more. But we're also expected by many of our allies to provide more military support. Okay, so this isn't just, I mean, yeah, part of this is, you know, self-interest of Americans and American imperialism or whatever you want to call it. But increasingly, the role that we assumed just for a period of time in World War I becomes a permanent role by the end of World War II for the United States, which is we are now increasingly expected to be that intervening decisive military power that will determine the outcome of a war and stabilize things. And that includes things like stabilizing the global economy or stabilizing the value of the dollar or stabilizing whatever it is. That is, the whole model becomes one of not constant, you know, destabilization and violence, but somehow of a regime of stability, which by the late 1940s, people like the editors of Time magazine would be referring to as the American century. Okay, the United States is moving toward the absolute center of global power in this period of time. They're just not there yet. Clearly, we are pretty much there in terms of our industrial capacity. You know, World War II would really be where we reveal the extraordinary capacity of American industry and American capital to change the world. Okay, but we're going through these growing pains, right? Both internationally and domestically. We're paying the price for that kind of expansive global power and the exercise of that power. And it's not all good. You know, it's not all bad, but it's not all good. And everything has a cost. For journalists, then part of that cost is we got to decide how to do our jobs. You know, I mean, it's one thing when you are, remember, a lot of these were the same journalists who were the muckrakers back home, and not all of them, but a lot of them who were used to, you know, ratting out, you know, corruption and big city machine politics and all that kind of stuff. And there they were considered to be, some of them, heroic, except for the ones, of course, who were socialists. But now they're covering the war. And, you know, was there corruption in the American Expeditionary Force? Was there incompetence? Absolutely. And with the French? Absolutely. And with the Brits, absolutely. Well, they're the Brits. I mean, you know, what do they do that isn't bumbled? But, you know, if you start publishing that and revealing that in the midst of this conflagration where, you know, millions of people are being butchered, what good comes of that? You can say, well, ultimately, as Andrea suggested, ultimately, if we don't critique these things, we don't get better. We don't learn from them. And this is where journalism is often still described, it used to be, as the first rough draft of history. What we're going to learn from is first going to be captured by journalists. That used to be the conviction. And there was value in that. You know, I didn't learn about Watergate or the corruption of Vietnam and William Westmoreland. I didn't learn about that from commentators. I learned about that from daily journalism in newspapers and on TV. Okay, I didn't learn about that from opinion. There was an agreed upon set of facts. Now, Americans could interpret those facts in different ways, but it was the first rough draft of what would be the Vietnam era. And a lot of it they had right. They did. Okay, some of it they had wrong, but you know, you've got to go with the access you're given. At the time of World War I, it was pretty much accepted. You know, we can't traffic in all of this news. This was nothing like the way that we would fight or that journalists would report Vietnam. Nothing like that. But that's 2 generations removed. Okay. Anything else either of you wanted to add, or you know, anything like that?
Yeah, I had one other thing that actually there were several American reporters, including Brown that I mentioned before, who had offered the U.S. government to be like a willing propagandist. And Brown specifically was going to be stationed in Spain to kind of go around and interview people and kind of observe the general like political and economic situation there and kind of get a feel for their sentiments towards the U.S. and the war to see how they could best use propaganda to get Spain to join the Allies.
Yeah, and if you think about it, you know, we hear that now and we think, gee, that sounds pretty sinister. That's not an objective journalist. Well, we're not talking about just, you know, American news here. Remember that, you know, you don't know anything about Haywood Brown, but Haywood Brown first came to my attention as a sports writer. You know, I was reading old articles that he was a very good writer. He had a very lively style and everything. And I only learned later that, that he was a straight journalist as well. And he was a kind of, I don't know, he was one of the muckrakers. He was one of the people. I don't know that it's accurate to call him a socialist necessarily, but he was definitely one of those, the classic, comfort the afflicted, afflict the comfortable. That was Haywood Brown, except for war. Then suddenly he is functioning as a propagandist. He's willing to do that because he's a firm believer that the ultimate American mission is benevolent. Yeah, Brett.
And I haven't read enough just volumes of things to definitively say that I know exactly what I'm talking about here. But military historians, I feel like, tend to focus on the military aspects and the battles and all of that kind of stuff, whereas more, academic historians focus on other things. So there's this gap, I think, between examining how journalists were trying to execute their duties and how the troops on the ground felt about those guys being there. And so from that just practical standpoint, it almost encourages the journalists to be propagandists, because I could tell you, having extra people involved in a war and battle and all that kind of stuff, it infinitely complicates things.
Yes.
And officers are already, especially when you're dealing with a draft. Like I served with a full volunteer force, so allegedly everyone wanted to be there, and corralling all of that mess of humanity is already difficult enough. And then to add in the element of people who actively don't want to be there and were forced to be there, and then this whole other element who you think they're like almost outside of your control, and then you think are working actively against you, and then the Joe Galloway comes to mind from Vietnam. That's another story. Like, as far as the troops on the ground, if they think you're going to be sending things back home that are negative, your safety all of a sudden becomes in question. And there's just a lot of dynamics from being where the battles are that I think encourage propaganda as opposed to straight, honest, truthful journalism. And I just don't know to what aspect that gets examined academically.
Well, it depends on who you're reading. I mean, if you look at the memoirs that some of the journalists wrote who went through that great disillusionment in Vietnam, who started out the way a Haywood Brown would have done or something like that, with the idea that, well, this is America, this is my country, man, we're the good guys. They're, and then you start realizing, no, you know what, in Southeast Asia, we're kind of the redcoats. I mean, this is not, and when you hear that from the enlisted men in particular, they're realizing we're the redcoats. They see us as invaders. There's no single truth to war. There never is. There's certainly no single truth to combat other than who goes home and who doesn't. That's really the only truth of combat, I would suggest. There are scholars who do that. The problem, Brett, with scholars, especially now, most of them never were in combat. And most of them were, I mean, I'm honest about it, right? I was too young for Vietnam. I missed it by 2 years, okay? And, I'm ambivalent about that because a lot of my buddies and their older brothers had to go. And I felt guilty in a way that I wasn't drafted and didn't have to go through that. Part of me is like, yeah, I'm glad I didn't have to go through that. I'm not a fighter. I'm a coward, or whatever. You never know what you are until you face it. But you're right. I mean, you get a lot of journalists today with no experience of combat or no experience of military command and control. And we're, you know what? Yes, of course, because we're not a military society. That's what you want. Even if you're a soldier, that's what you want. But when you put the two of them together, Brett, I think what you're suggesting is that it can be oil and water, and somebody's got to manage that. That's where the pool reporting system was introduced with the first Iraq War, the Gulf War, where I remember guys I knew who were trying to cover the war were saying, yeah, they only let one of us go, and you got to have an officer with you, and enlisted men can't talk to you unless there's an officer present and everything else. And this isn't like Vietnam. This isn't like Vietnam. I was like, no, it's not like Vietnam, because in the minds of the Pentagon, that didn't work out too well. So I understand exactly what you're saying. And I think there is there is a gap in the scholarship in connecting those dots that, somebody with that experience maybe ought to get a degree and go write that book, young man. I'm just saying. Andrea, I'm sorry, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, I just kind of have like a curiosity question. I'm kind of just curious on when you think that military censorship started to get better, because I read in the reading that it started to get like a little bit better around 1918, but the reading wasn't like really specific about how
What do you mean military censorship started to get better?
Like Americans started to see like a more accurate picture of the war and like what actually happened, like more detail.
Yeah. I think it probably was. Well, one of the things that happened is that a first wave of people came home from that war, and they were shattered. So, people were smelling a rat. Also, people in country who were trying to balance that oil and water lack of chemistry with the armed personnel, somehow to do everybody fair and everything else, were finding even the enlisted men saying, "This is madness. This is madness. Look at what's happening here." That's what happened in Vietnam too. It wasn't as bad, that kind of rebellion of the foot soldier, I don't think, was that bad in World War I. But remember, World War I didn't last that long, and Americans were only there for a year. And within a year, they were completely disillusioned and wanted to go home. And so I think there was a sense that when the tide of the war began to turn and the victories became somewhat more decisive in favor of, not the Central Powers, that I don't think it changed overwhelmingly. I think what had happened by then is journalists had learned what was expected of them. And so the armed forces didn't have to be as heavy-handed in saying, you can't do that. Journalists came to understand, now I know what I can and can't say. I know what, I've got a better sense of, first of all, they were there long enough to understand what was happening. Because that was the thing. This, for a lot of people, was unprecedented. Because we had the barbarism of pre-industrial warfare. And then we had the absolute, annihilation that could only be visited upon people in an industrial age, especially when you introduce gases and things like that. Sarin gas, mustard gas, things like that. That changed everything, especially sarin, because you couldn't see it and you couldn't really smell it. And it was deadly, And so then it was kind of like, I think it was that sense of horror that everyone was experiencing. But my notion of that history is that the real deconstruction of that trench warfare and everything didn't really occur until after the war was over. And indeed, it was delayed by a year because of a flu pandemic, because people were dying of that the way they'd been dying in war, on the American side, right? So I don't think it was a massive my understanding is it wasn't a massive transformation, like all of a sudden the AEF just said, hey, you guys can say anything you want. I think it was that they understood together, okay, this is the way we have to do this. So it was just greater experience, both by the military. Remember, we hardly had a standing army when we went into this thing. We had people drilling with broomsticks and things like that, we were a primitive military. We were an advanced industrial power, but a primitive military power. We were borrowing gear. We were doing anything we could do. A lot of the gear we were given was junk, So all that stuff had to be aired out. I don't think that happened until the 20s. That's my understanding of it. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, that was kind of what I was asking. I think you answered it pretty well. Okay.
It is an interesting thing, and it's worth a lot more study. I do think that Brett does bring up a really important point, though, that, a lot of us, especially now, the whole thing is, free speech, and we have a right to do what we want, and we can go demonstrate and everything else, and that's fine. But war is different. Whether you like it or not, war is different. And when you are deploying hundreds of thousands of Americans to go, ultimately millions, to go around the world with deadly force, okay, that's not just a thing. That's not just, let's go out and demonstrate, to raise awareness of climate change. That's people who are carrying absolute destructive force with them and are prepared and trained and conditioned in how to use it effectively. There's nothing else that human beings do that's like that. You know, it's like we were talking about the propaganda. It's not a football game. It's mayhem. You know, you can do it in a disciplined, orderly way, or at least it can look that way from a distance. But war is just simply different in this sense. And reporting on that is not like reporting on anything else. It's just not. It's different. And so, Andrea, the thing is, there's a learning curve. Journalists have to learn. And what happened in Vietnam, after going through a couple of years of Westmoreland and the 5 o'clock follies, and knowing that they were being lied to by MACV, they just said, to hell with it. I'm going to go out. I'm going to approach this second lieutenant here who's just gotten out of ROTC and doesn't know which end of the gun is the right one. And I'm going to see if I can convince him to let me go out on patrol with his platoon. And I'm going to go, you know, and I'm going to saddle up and go out there with him. And now they're bothered because they're like, oh, shit, here's one more guy we got to take care of and make sure we get his ass home. And he can't even help because he can't carry a gun, you know. Once that was sorted out, the stories they were bringing back were relatively unfiltered, okay? And that created all kinds of problems. Now, all this is, Andrew, I think what you were talking about, the way that you learn from this is to be honest about it, I think was the first point you were making, that is hard for us to remember with war. You know, how honest can you be when you're trying to prosecute the destruction of another part of the species? How much truth can you really tell? This is something that news media have been struggling with, you know, for well over a century, when we've emerged into that sort of permanent state of military readiness that was not typical of America for the first 120, 30 years of its existence. Okay, does that make sense? Okay. All right, are there about any of the three readings, any other thoughts, observations, questions, things that might not be clear to you? I think you can see a theme emerging here. What happens with, you know, a constitutionally protected right to a free press or to free speech or free expression when you start projecting force around the world and becoming a danger to the rest of the world, you know, where journalism can either subvert or advance that military industrial agenda that becomes permanent, certainly by the end of the Second World War. The mobilization we saw during the Second World War was as transformative of the country as was the Spanish-American War to introducing America to empire. You know, we have these sort of seismic transformations of American culture, American society, and American power, okay? And I'm trying to allow you to kind of see that through these analyses and discussions of media. Okay, does that make sense what I'm trying to do here? Yeah, okay. Anything else? All right, then I think what we'll do, we got a lot done, you know, I think it's a good time to stop. We've got plenty of time, don't worry about it. I think what we'll try to do then next week is we'll do the remaining three presentations. If there's time and we're not too fried, I'll give you the beginnings of a brief overview of Module 3. We may wait till the following week to do that. And then by next week, when we finish those, I'll tell you, well, here's the deadline for the upcoming assignment. Does that make sense? Okay, and obviously, you know, those of you who present, just make sure you do your notes, but you won't be writing anything other than the notes. Does that make sense? All right, then. Have a good weekend. Oh, I'm sorry. I heard somebody.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, so are the notes due then the Sunday after we do the presentations next week?
Yeah, the notes will not, in other words, I don't shut off the notes until after the deadline to turn in the written assignment.
Okay.
In other words, I left them for a couple of days. I didn't shut them off until Tuesday afternoon for the first module because a couple of people said they wanted to finish or add something else in there, so I left them open. But still a couple of people didn't do that. Again, as I said, you got an amnesty on the notes, not the assignments, but the notes for the first module. Don't worry, no going back. Just figure, okay, we're done with that as far as the assignment, but we'll figure that out as we move on. Anything else? All right, then enjoy your weekend and I'll see you next week.
Thanks.